Hi, everybody. I know folks are still coming on in, but if you could grab your lunch and have a seat. I'm really excited today to introduce our new colleague, Dr. Julie Maslowski, who studies from the perspectives of adolescent development science and population science. She brings that together with reproductive health work and really is interested in having an action plan for this research and forming developmentally appropriate policies and practices for adolescent sexual and reproductive health issues. You may have seen her in the news. She comments a lot on relevant topics. She was in the Washington Post about O-pill, which is the first over-the-counter birth control pill, which I saw at the store the other day, and I was very excited. I wanted to buy it just because I could, but
it's hanging on my.
Is it? It's a little bit expensive, but also has been really a voice in the post-Roe era for reproductive health issues for younger folks, teens, and others. So she just got a really fantastic proposal funded through NICHD that's going to set up a state policy data dashboard longitudinally to look at the policies and practices around state reproductive health from 1973 to 2028. We're super excited about this new resource. So Julie's going to be doing some fantastic stuff, and she has just joined us at Michigan starting in January, I believe, and is part of our center. So we're thrilled to have her here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and hi. Thank you for having me today. So I will be talking about adolescent abortion and contraception post-Dobbs. Here's an outline of what I'll cover. So I'll give some background and context on both abortion and contraception among adolescents. And then I'll look at how the landscape has changed post-Dobbs and what we know so far. It's early, but what we know so far about the impacts of changes on adolescents. I'll talk about there are a number of data limitations, particularly when we want to study minors in this area. So we recently put out a research agenda trying to fill some of those data limitations. I'll talk about that. And then just a bit about the new project that Sarah mentioned. So as we know, on June 24th, 2022, the US Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs v. Jackson that the US Constitution does not provide federal protections for the right to abortion, thereby allowing each individual state to decide how to regulate abortion. This is the map as of at least a couple days ago. We're always trying to keep track of what the latest policies are. This is from New York Times, showing the darkest red colors are states that have fully banned abortion, and then the subsequent colors are have gestational limits on abortion, and it's 22 states, so nearly half of states have bans, gestational limits or full bans. These are trends prior to Dobbs. So these are trends in the number, rate, and ratio of abortions. So number is just number, rate is per 1,000 women of childbearing age, and ratio is ratio of abortions to live births. And what we can see is that from 2012 to 2021, we had some decrease, but then 2021, kind of heading into Dobbs, we had an increase in the number of abortions and what looks like slight increases in both the rates and ratios as well. And the question, of course, is what happened once we had bans in place. So these data take a while to come in. The Society of Family Planning, which is a professional society where I do a lot of my work, has stood up an effort called We Count. And this is an effort to actually count. So they're trying not to sample, but actually count the number of abortions that are being performed in the US. And they started just before Dobbs. And their most recent data release was through March of 24. And these are monthly. And the colors that they introduced toward the end, I won't get into the nuances there, but they are trying to understand the impact of telehealth, because we know that some patients who are living in states that have bans are accessing medication abortion through telehealth. And so they really are trying to tease that out as well. But essentially what we can see is monthly, from pre-Dobbs to post-Dobbs, the number of abortions has not gone down and has perhaps even gone up. And so we're seeing that access has been maintained despite the fact that 22 states are limiting access. Some of that driven by telehealth. We also know that many people are traveling to access care. I wanted to give some context on adolescents in particular. So I have 3 trend lines here from 1973 to 2023. The top orange line is pregnancies, the middle blue line is births, the bottom green line is abortions. And what we can see is that all 3 have been trending down over decades. You'll see that both the pregnancy and abortion lines stop at 2017, and I'll get to this more in the data limitations section, but essentially we don't always get data separately for minors or for adolescents, and so we haven't seen pregnancy and abortion data. They're coming, but we haven't seen those stratified out. But essentially what we can see is that births were trending down. We don't exactly know what's happening with abortion rate among adolescents, and that's part of what our group has been working on. But we do know prior to Dobbs, so these data are from 2017. This shows the abortion ratio, so ratio of abortions to live births among adolescents ages 15 to 19, and this is by state. So we can see that 5 years prior to Dobbs, there was tremendous state variation in the ratio of abortions to live births. And ranging from, let's see, New Jersey has a ratio of almost 0.59, Kentucky the lowest, 0.11. And then does anybody care to guess what the red versus green lines delineate? Yes. Right, so states that now have bans, yes. And so this shows that even prior to Dobbs, access was limited in those states that now have bans. And the average is the blue line, kind of halfway in the middle there. Adolescents make up approximately 1 in 10 abortion patients. So on this pie chart, adolescents are the peach and the green. So minors are peach and green is 18 to 19-year-olds. So despite the fact that they're about 1 in 10, we just know very little about adolescents in particular and abortion access. So we have a couple projects in place that we are trying to quantify just sort of some really basic things that we would like to know about adolescents and abortion access. So one is how many adolescents are, what percentage of the population of adolescents is living in a state that has a ban. So in this ongoing work, we're estimating it's about 54% of 13 to 19-year-olds. And then we want to know what percentage of studies are including minors. And our estimate, these are both in progress, which is why I've asterisked them. But our estimate is only about 3% of studies on abortions are including minors. And among those that include minors, many don't stratify their results. So although minors are in the sample, we're not sure to what extent the findings represent those of the minors. So we know very little from the evidence, but what we do know is that the barriers to accessing abortion are disproportionate for minors in particular, and that the impacts of restrictive policies are exaggerated. So on the right, I show an op-ed that we put out 2 days after the Dobbs ruling called "A Major Problem for Minors." I can't take credit for that name. I'm not quite that clever, but in which we laid out, even pre-Dobbs, all of the ways in which there are disproportionate barriers for adolescents to access care. And then among adolescents, of course, historically marginalized groups are going to be the most impacted. And here's where I want to mention that I do all of my work within the framework of reproductive justice. So this is a really important framework, given that we know in the past there has been an approach that feels like population control when we are talking about births and pregnancy prevention and contraception and abortion and sterilizations, and particularly communities of color have felt very targeted and very discriminated by that. And so reproductive justice is, I find, to be a really brilliant and broad-reaching framework developed by Black feminist scholars. The current most common definition of reproductive justice is that of Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. And it is that reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to choose when and how to have children or not, and to parent those children in safe and sustainable communities. So it's covering quite a bit, as you can see. It builds from the intersectionality framework that is, of course, of Michigan's own Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality puts forth that all of us, live within interconnected social categorizations, and some of us inhabit multiple marginalized identities, which are associated with overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and/or disadvantage. And I want to point out, we often think of age discrimination in terms of older people, but younger people in this country also experience age discrimination. The term for that is adultism, which means prejudice and systematic discrimination against young people. So young people have systematically fewer rights and less control over their bodies than adults, meaning that youth in many ways, and especially in an abortion context, is a marginalized identity. And then, of course, we have youth of other marginalized identities who are navigating these systems, and it becomes very complicated. So youth of color, those of low SES, and other marginalized groups are disproportionately impacted. And the reproductive justice framework, building on intersectionality, goes much broader than reproduction. So it thinks explicitly about historical injustice and how it plays into where we are today. So, for example, we know that the medical field of gynecology has extremely racist roots, including experimentation on people of color, and that much of the way it is practiced is still built on those roots. It articulates ties between multiple societal challenges, for example, police violence and reproductive autonomy. So we can see in the photo on the right, the sign says all mothers were summoned when he called out for his mama, George Floyd, making the explicit link there. It integrates really beautifully both individual and structural level determinants of health or of inequity. So, for example, thinking about an individual's rights to access reproductive health care, but also their contextual safety, their health, and the laws and policies of their particular context. And importantly, it centers both intersectional and anti-racist solutions. And I'm sorry that my citations are not showing up, but I am citing Loretta Ross, Ricky Solinger, and Dorothy Roberts here. So then some of the barriers that adolescents experienced pre-Dobbs that have become even bigger barriers post-Dobbs to accessing an abortion include travel. So travel is difficult for many people, but if you're an adolescent, you may not have a license, you may not drive, you may not have access to a car. Private carriers like a Greyhound bus or an Amtrak or an airline all have pretty restrictive policies about whether minors can travel interstate and usually require parents to be involved. Increasingly, we're seeing policies that attempt to limit minors' access to travel. So, I'll tell you about a couple states that have introduced laws called abortion trafficking laws. So Idaho was the first. Tennessee now has passed a law as well. And so this is, in this bill, they created, it's a new criminal offense called abortion trafficking. This had not existed before. And it includes helping a minor without their parents' consent, doing essentially anything that would help them access an out-of-state abortion. So certainly providing transportation, but providing funds, even information. I think it's up for interpretation how broad this could be, but it's a felony. It's punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And essentially, part of the intent here is just to undermine whatever support adolescents may have to access care out of state. In addition, so parental involvement is sometimes required in states, and so this is a requirement for either parental consent or notification prior to the abortion. And although it sounds perhaps like, yes, we would want adolescents to have their parents' support, the truth is that the majority of adolescents already have it. So regardless of whether it is statutorily required, the majority, 75% or so, are already choosing to involve either a parent or a supportive adult, not everybody lives in a nuclear family, in their abortion care. And then those who are not choosing to involve an adult cite danger or logistical impediments. For example, my first faculty appointment was in Texas, and we had a number of teens there who are from Mexico and their parents are still in Mexico, right? So parents are not physically present. Parents may be incarcerated, people may be estranged from parents, and usually there's a guardian in place there, but the guardian is not allowed to provide consent. So these parental involvement requirements are associated with delays in care and also increased birth rates in states that have them. So prior to Dobbs, we had a requirement that every state offer a judicial bypass process. And this is that the adolescent can, by definition, independently go before a judge and ask for a bypass on the parental involvement requirement. As you can imagine, many adolescents aren't aware that this is an option. It's a very scary option to be a pregnant teen without parental support going before a judge. It's complicated. Many states aren't quite sure how to administer it. Many judges aren't willing to see these cases, so it can be hard to get a judge to see the cases. And then teens who do go through it find it quite traumatic. This was reliant on a Roe precedent, and so now that Roe has fallen, this is no longer a requirement that judicial bypass be offered. It's still offered in most states where abortion is legal, however. So we have only 14 states that allow minors to access abortion without parental consent or notification. So Montana should be green here. This map wasn't updated, but you'll see Michigan is not green. So Michigan does still have a parental consent requirement. So we know that Michigan a couple years ago passed the Reproductive Health Act, and I wasn't living here at the time, so I wasn't following the drama point for point, but essentially it was written originally to get rid of the parental involvement requirement in the state of Michigan, and there was opposition to that. There were public, this has happened in a number of states. Commercials are made opposing this. There's a lot of, really a lot of sort of fear-based marketing based on allowing adolescents to access abortion independently. And so it was removed prior to the vote on the act, which was then signed by the governor. So there are plans, I believe, within the House to introduce amendments that would remove the parental consent requirement, but it's not there now. Similar thing happened in Ohio. We see this happening over and over again, where minors' access to care is sort of a concession that gets made pretty frequently in order to pass the overall bill. Did you have a quick question?
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
In the green states, is there any
That's a good question, and I can't tell you every single state, but yes, there are some where they do make age different age requirements. So, for example, Massachusetts is 16 and above, and they are working on lowering it. Oregon, I think, is 14 and above, and then below 14, I think they get 2 physicians to sign off. Then it can be, they built in like an additional step there. Yes. And so as a developmental psychologist, I get asked all the time, what's the age? You know, pick an age at which they can clearly consent. And it doesn't work that way. And we wrote a whole paper about it that I'll tell you about in a minute. So this is a report by Human Rights Watch about the harms that Michigan's forced parental consent law is causing. And so it details individual cases and also the literature showing that judicial bypass introduces trauma and delays in care. Do I have, I'll tell you later about its limitations. Okay, so other barriers that adolescents face. So adolescents have limited information by definition, by fact of them being younger, having had less exposure to information, less exposure to the medical system. We also know that fewer than 50% of adolescents are receiving comprehensive sex ed, and that few sex ed curricula can address abortion. So there's limited information, and adults are, especially physicians in banned states, are increasingly unsure of what information they are allowed to give. So we're getting a lot of requests at my org to write guidelines and to try and guide physicians on what they can be providing. Cost is a barrier for many people, particularly for adolescents who don't have independent sources of money usually, and limited access to telehealth. So telehealth has become an important access point for many people, but even in states where telehealth is legal and it is legal to provide telehealth to minors, some providers are nervous to provide it, worrying that they may be targeted as a result. So even in states where abortion is protected, adolescents are differentially impacted by the laws that are on the books. So something like a waiting period, a mandatory ultrasound, or an in-person requirement is just going to introduce more logistical requirements that are harder for adolescents to meet. And then a gestational age limit can be harder for adolescents. Adolescents usually recognize pregnancies later in gestation. Perhaps they're not expecting it. They're less familiar with what it feels like. And also menstruation is not as regular among adolescents. And it may take a while to turn up to care. And so with all of that, they usually recognize pregnancies later, putting them closer to the gestational age limit, giving them less time to access care. So we have a systematic review under review, looking at what studies we do have available and what they identify about the barriers to abortion among adolescents. And so we found, in addition to those that I've told you about, legal and logistical, and lack of information, that adolescents experience pressure both from partners and from parents, and that is either to have an abortion or not to have an abortion. So that pressure kind of goes both ways. So we see that there are just a number of barriers in place. All right, and now to switch gears and go to contraception, which is, as you can imagine, pretty deeply tied to much of this. This data shows you what percentage of adolescents, both male and female, used a contraceptive method the last time they had sex. These are high school students from the YRBS 2021. So the left-hand side is condoms, blue are males, orange are females, gray is the total. And we're seeing that the majority of males are reporting using a condom. But then if we go to the middle column, effective hormonal birth control, so the average is only about a third of adolescents, high schoolers are reporting using effective hormonal birth control. And then dual methods, which is what the medical community would like all of us to use, is right around 10%. And actually, what I'll tell you is that historically, these are pretty good numbers. So these numbers are on the rise, but yet there is still quite a bit of work to be done, as we can see. So just some trends to put things in perspective. So overall, this is an increase in using any method, using highly effective methods. So long-acting reversible contraceptives like an intrauterine device or an implant are higher than they've been in the past, although still not particularly common among adolescents. But what we're seeing decreases in is condom use and corresponding increases in STI rates. So one important source of contraceptive care for adolescents is providers who are funded by Title X. Title X is a federal funding stream allocated under Title X of the Public Health Service Act. And so in addition to it funds a broad range of services. So of course, contraceptive services and supplies, but also things like breast and cervical cancer screenings and STI testing, education, and treatment. And so this is a stream of funding that providers can apply for. And it serves almost 400,000 minors per year and about 3 to 4 million Americans per year. It was established under the Nixon administration, and its fundamental principles are that it should be a safety net, a source of care. And so essentially, no client can be turned away because of inability to pay, because of their age, which is why it's an important source for adolescents. And it also provides confidential care. So parental involvement is not required under the federal statute in any state. This has become an issue in Texas. So I worked in Texas for 7 years. It was my first faculty appointment. It's a really interesting place. And there is a lawsuit that has come out of Texas called Deanda v. Becerra. This was brought forward by a father, Deanda, who says that parents have a constitutional right to direct the upbringing of their children, and that the federal government is subverting these constitutional and statutory rights through Title X by funding projects that distribute contraception and family planning services to minors without parental notification or consent, in violation of Texas statutes that require that consent. So Texas is one of 2 states that requires parental consent. And so Title X clinics were the only place in Texas where minors could access care without parental consent. And I don't have the statistic here, but like abortion, the vast majority of minors are involving their parents in their contraceptive care. And those who aren't, again, are fearing, either have logistical impediments to doing so or are fearing harm. So it's unclear sort of who this is forcing to get parental consent, but the law is there. And so the timeline of this lawsuit, it went before the Texas Northern District Court in December of 2022. Judge Matthew Kaczmarek, this is also the judge who first saw the lawsuit about the FDA's approval of mifepristone. So this is a judge where these cases are brought because this judge is known to be friendly to these cases. He ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, saying, yes, even though Title X is a federal statute, it is in violation of a state statute, which is not how the law works, but it was ruled that way. I don't have my JD yet. I think every day that I should go get one. But in March 2024, this went to the Fifth Circuit Appeals, and it was upheld at the Fifth Circuit. And so the ruling stands in Texas. And there are a number of advocate organizations out there who typically would challenge this ruling at the Fifth Circuit and take it to the Supreme Court. And they're actually nervous about doing so because they're afraid it would lose at the Supreme Court and then that this would apply to all states. So the thought, at least for now, was to let it sit at the appeals court level, and it was applying just to Texas. But then Texas decided to move it forward anyway. So in July of 24, Texas sued the Biden administration, and they said because the Biden administration continues to administer Title X in other states, they're now in violation of this federal ruling that came from the Fifth Circuit. So that lawsuit is in progress. We'll see how and when it moves forward. But Title X is under threat because of this, and this would be a big blow to minors in particular. So it is perhaps not surprising that more young people are choosing permanent sterilization after abortion restrictions have come into play and such threats as the Title X threat have come up. So I'll show you some of our data. It's still under review, but it'll be accepted any day now. So these are data from IQVIA. IQVIA is a repository of medical claims data. So it includes nearly all medical claims nationally. And so these are, what I'm showing you is a percent change from the month before. So essentially how much higher or lower the number of sterilizations procedures are versus the month before. So we're looking at 2022, and was it higher or lower than 2021? And the dotted line there is May of 22. So the Dobbs ruling was in June, but you'll recall that there was a leak of the opinion in May. And so we all knew what was coming in May, and we started to see anticipatory reactions in May. So that's why we've dotted the line there. And I'll show you both tubal sterilizations and vasectomy. This is tubal sterilizations. And so what we can see, and the blue line is younger, so ages 19 to 26, and the red line is older, 27 to 44. So we can see that almost immediately after the leak, we saw big spikes. So for example, in August of 22, the number of tubal sterilizations being done among 19 to 26-year-olds was 59% higher than it was the year prior. So this is a significant difference, as you might imagine. So this was driven by younger folks. So young folks seeking tubal sterilizations in the immediate aftermath of Dobbs. Quick clarifying question? Yeah. I believe so, yes, yes. And I think that's why we're calling it tubal sterilization and not tubal ligation, yes. And then, so these are vasectomy procedures. So again, blue is younger, and you can see really driven by younger folks here. So August of 2022, we had 117% more procedures than in August of 21 among young people in particular, although the increase is significant among the 27 to 44-year-olds as well. And then I'll show you, this is by whether your state was likely to ban abortion or not. And so what we have, blue are tubal sterilizations, red are vasectomy, and dotted lines are states that were not likely to ban abortion. Solid lines are those that were likely to ban. And so this is, the Guttmacher Institute put out a list that was widely adopted by all the major news outlets, as is your state going to ban abortion? And it's almost 100% correspondence between who has banned, but it was an early forecast. And so we used that because that was the information that folks had at the time about their state. And you can see that if you are living in a state that is likely to ban, you were more likely, both among vasectomy seekers and tubal seekers, to seek the procedure. And so this is also a significant interaction, and we can see that it's driven by the tubals. Okay, so then I want to talk about how the landscape has changed, what we're seeing on the, what impacts we can see and start to pick up on adolescents. So I wrote a piece for The Conversation. It's a great outlet. Michigan is a founding partner. I would really encourage folks to look into it. It's only for academics, so they put me through a verification process to make sure I was a real academic, to disseminate your scholarship in, I think, 1,000-word format, and put it in very lay language. And it's not an op-ed, so there are no should statements. It's just a digest of what your research says and what your professional opinion is on what it means. So I wrote this piece called "Abortion Bans Are Changing What It Means to Be Young in America." And what I drew on are early indicators. I drew on the contraception threats that I've told you about, the sterilization procedures, the increase in sterilization. I won't talk about mental health today, but we're seeing signals that young people's mental health is being driven by this. We absolutely have data about college decisions, about deciding where to live, about career decisions, where to train as a medical provider, voting, what is driving voting patterns and voting registration. So we're seeing a lot of the domains in young people's lives are being impacted by this. And critically, this is impacting all young people, not just people who become pregnant, not just people who have uteruses, right? We're seeing it across the board. It's really a very impactful issue where we're seeing the majority of young people are not wanting to live and build lives in states where their reproductive rights are restricted. And a lot of what I was drawing on in that came from a series of studies we did. We wanted to move quickly, and so we needed a source of data that we could get quickly. And luckily, my colleagues, so this was led by Bianca Allison, who's a junior faculty that I mentor at UNC. She is good colleagues with Tammy Chang in family medicine, who has this amazing study called My Voice. So this is a panel of young people she maintains. They're ages 14 to 24. There's about 1,100 of them. It's a great source of data. I really encourage you all to look into it. Approximately nationally representative, very diverse sample, 49 states. And what they do is they send a qualitative survey, a 5-question qualitative survey every Friday afternoon to this panel, and it's about social topics that impact young people. So I'm actually in their pilot sample, so I get the text every Friday. And it's some of you, I'm sure, are using it because it's questions you'd be interested in. It's questions about bullying, about gun violence, about the environment, about all the things that we study. And they're getting young people's input on this. And so we conducted a 4-wave study starting immediately after the leak, then after the decision, then a few months out from the Dobbs decision, and then we did a wave about a year later to look at contraceptive impacts. We, in total, had 835 respondents in 49 states, a diverse both gender and racial ethnic breakdown, and we were asking them about their knowledge and awareness of the Dobbs decision and changes in abortion policy, what opinions they had about it, where they got their information about this, and what resources they or someone they knew would need if they were seeking abortion care. And I have to tell you, I'm like just barely Gen Z, I think, but I send very short text messages. These young people sent us paragraphs about what they knew, about how they felt about it. So it turned out to be really rich and beautiful data about how they were feeling about these decisions. And I read all of them, and it was really impactful to get a window into how young people were experiencing this. And so the first paper we put out that I felt was really important, because we often see that older people are accusing young people of not knowing what's going on, of being uninformed, of not paying attention to current events, right? And building a lot of restrictions off of that, is that no, they were actually very aware. So based on the first wave of data, which we collected on May 20th, 2022, so 18 days after the opinion was leaked, 89% of 14 to 24-year-olds were aware of the potential changes to abortion access. So they knew what had happened, they knew what the Dobbs decision was about and what its implications could be. 68% of them opposed the changes, the restrictions. They expressed anger, fear, sadness. So really just, they know what's going on and they're not happy about it. Some of the quotes that we got were, for example, so this question was, how do you feel about these potential changes? One person said, horrible, abortion is healthcare and should be accessible to everyone. One said, I don't agree with it whatsoever because people should be able to choose. And one said, I fear that these changes are only a precursor to more strict laws regarding contraception and healthcare. I fear for the rights and bodies of those like me and those who are less fortunate. I should say, I think about 17% of the sample expressed very pro restriction of rights sentiments, and would say things like abortion is murder, this is the right thing to do, people who get an abortion should go to hell. So we absolutely did get those sentiments. They just weren't the majority. And then there was a small sort of undecided or I don't know group as well. Sarah hinted, one bright spot that we've had on the landscape post-Dobbs is OPIL. So has anybody seen? You should look for OPIL. We have it all around. Target has it, your CVS has it. So it's here, it's available. And so this is a daily oral contraceptive. It's a progestin-only pill. So there are two types combined, which have estrogen and progestin. This has progestin only, which means that it has fewer side effects than a combined oral pill, and has been deemed to be safe for over-the-counter use for people of any age. This is important, right? So I was actually involved with this approval. I was brought on by the manufacturer because they were anticipating pushback from the FDA. They wanted no age restrictions. They were anticipating pushback. The history of this is that in the late 90s, early 2000s, Plan B, which is also known as the morning after pill, went up for approval through the FDA. It was approved, but it originally had age restrictions. So 21 brought down to 19. And as you can imagine, age restrictions target people who aren't under that age. It ended up being a real barrier for a lot of people. So someone who doesn't have an ID, think about who are the people who don't have IDs, someone who maybe didn't bring their ID with them, someone wanted to discriminate against for some reason, right? So it ended up introducing disproportionate barriers even to people who were young, but it was a long, very politicized fight to eventually get the age restrictions dropped. And so they were hoping to avoid that process this time. But during the Plan B hearings, there were all sorts of pushbacks, everything from adolescents aren't mature enough to do this, to this is going to enable trafficking, all sorts of sort of fears about this is bad for young people. So I worked with my dear colleague who's a general pediatrician to work on the literature that we know about adolescent decision making, about understanding of medical decisions like this one, and also about the public health impacts of making it available to minors. So I had to include, this is grainy, but this is when we got our unanimous yes vote from the Scientific Advisory Committee. So we were there, all, about 150 of us who had worked on this, and the ones who have been doing this for a decade and a half were like huddled in a football huddle and just hoping. And then we got our unanimous vote saying that the Scientific Advisory Panel did recommend that young people and that all people should be able to access this. So this means 4.5 million sexually active adolescents have a new accessible option for contraception. And I would be remiss not to mention, I was not involved with the Free the Pill Youth Council, but this was a really mighty group of young people who did a very participatory for like a decade. They did a lot of participatory work. They built the movement on social media. They educated young people about why this was important. They got them involved. They got them to testify for the FDA. Every voting member of that panel remarked on how moving the young people were, talking about what it means to have barriers to contraception as a young person. And this is widely credited as being a huge part of why this was a success. So young people are powerful when we get them involved. And yet, they're still being accused of not being mature enough to make decisions about their body. So this was a case in 2022 after the Dobbs decision. A 16-year-old in Florida attempted to go through the judicial bypass process. So this was a person who was estranged from her parents. She had a guardian, a supportive guardian, but the guardian was not allowed to give consent. So she was asking for a bypass, and the judge ruled that no, she wasn't mature enough. And there are no guidelines for judges to make these decisions. As a developmental psychologist, I certainly have thoughts about what might constitute maturity. This judge cited her GPA as being low as evidence of not being mature enough. And so we're seeing that this is playing out. And so what does maturity mean? Often, or often enough, we're seeing that the amazing neuroscience research that has been done to understand brain development in adolescents is being weaponized against young people. So in the past couple decades, we've had great groundbreaking research that shows that the brain continues to mature until age 25 or so, right? Who has heard the brain isn't mature until age 25, right? I opened this article. There's a TikTok video where the woman wakes up and she says, "Hi, honey," and he says, "You look different," and she says, "Yeah." He says, "Happy birthday, honey. How does it feel to be 25? You look different." She says, "Yeah, it's my prefrontal cortex. It finally came online," right? It's on TikTok even, right? And of course, like, we don't flip a switch and the brain now works one day. These are heterogeneous and longitudinal and incremental processes that are happening. And so we're seeing that oppositional groups are saying the brain isn't mature till 25, so rights shouldn't be in place. Vivek Ramaswamy, who was a Republican presidential candidate at one point, had a proposal that voting should start at age 25, citing this neuroscience. And that is not the interpretation of any neuroscientist who does this work, of course. So myself and my two colleagues, Emily Buss, who's a lawyer at University of Chicago, and Laura Ray Lake, who's a developmental psychologist who focuses on voting rights for young people, we brought in updated neuroscience to show that we think we have a strong developmental science, both neuroscientific and behavioral case, supporting that adolescents can make these decisions. And I made the voting or the reproductive rights case, and Laura made the voting case, and they're both, I think, quite strong. But as some background, we do know that developmental science has been, and that neuroscience has been leveraged for the purposes of adolescents' rights. So in the criminal justice sphere, in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that the death penalty for minors is unconstitutional, and they were working with a group of developmental psychologists and neuroscientists on this, and they did hear evidence about the maturing brain and how the brain continues to mature, which it was argued made them less responsible, less culpable for their crimes. What was written in the Supreme Court ruling is quite a reduced form of the very nuanced science that they heard. But what was written was that adolescents' lack of maturity and underdeveloped sense of responsibility, which often leads to impetuous and ill-considered actions and decisions, make them less culpable, and therefore we shouldn't be executing them. In 2010, a similar ruling in Graham v. Florida that life without parole for minors is unconstitutional, with, again, reductive applications of early neuroimaging saying minors are all gas and no brakes, they can't control themselves, they can't help it, right? And these were widely considered to be victories in criminal justice because they were getting rid of very severe punishments for young people. However, what does this mean for reproductive rights? And actually, in Roper v. Simmons, Justice Kennedy remarked, what are you going to come back to me in a few years and ask for abortion rights for these young people after you've just argued that I shouldn't hold them culpable for crimes? So there's a series of articles written about that and why this is actually not. These two positions are not in opposition to each other. And so we built upon, Larry Steinberg is someone who did a lot of this work. We built upon Larry Steinberg's argument with the latest neuroscience, just showing that, I think I've got it here. What we know about the way that adolescents make decisions and about the way that brains work in context is that there are two broad types of decisions that are made, and we all do this as well. So you can characterize decisions into either reasoned or reactive. Reasoned being you have time to make the decision, you have time to consider both sides, to gather information, to get support. Reactive being very instantaneous in the moment sorts of decisions. So somebody punches you, do you punch them back? Somebody runs up to you at a party and says, hey, take this shot, do you take it or not? You're about to have sex, he doesn't want to put on a condom, do you have sex or not, right? In the moment, emotionally driven decisions are reactive. And what we know is that when we look at the neuroscience and that employs sort of tasks and tries to simulate decisional performance, reactive decision-making is where the maturing brain is less likely to perform the same as in adults. So adolescents are more likely to make what we call, quote unquote, impulsive, emotion-driven decisions in the moment, in a split second. And that can be traced to neuroscience and to white matter maturity and to multiple systems and how they work together. But reasoned decisions, we see that adolescents at age 14, 15, 16 are making decisions equivalent to those of adults. when they are given information, when they're given time, when they're given the ability to weigh pros and cons, and the ability to seek support, which is what most of us do when we're making a big decision as well, right? We do all of those things. And that having an abortion or seeking contraception are by definition reasoned decisions. This is not something you can do instantaneously. You have to interact with the medical system. You have to figure out where to go. You have to figure out what your options are. You're given lots of information, either written or from a person, from a professional. You have the opportunity to seek support if you want it. So this is by definition a reasoned decision. We also know that the early neuroscience that was focusing more on individual structures and their relative maturity has been widely replaced with a more integrative systems approach, showing that we're not just focused on the size or activation of an amygdala, for example, to see how emotional someone is. We don't have structures that map onto our behavior that cleanly, but instead we see that we have integrative systems that are coming on board and that can be compensatory in ways, and that adolescents are actually quite self-aware of their decision-making abilities and can exercise them and can call on the supports that they need. And I'm watching the clock, so I'm going to be good on time. And then if we wanted to match behaviorally the actual decisions that they would be asked to make in these situations, we have good studies showing that adolescents can comprehend package labeling on emergency contraception and on medication abortion drugs, that they can self-assess the gestational duration of their pregnancy, which is something that you need to do if you're seeking a medication abortion through telehealth. They show capacity to make medical decisions about hormonal contraception when it's being dispensed in a pharmacy setting. So when asked to do the exact task, they perform equivalently to adults. And then, of course, human rights. Law, medicine, many other fields are really using human rights as a basis for much of the work that they do. And so we argue in this paper, if there isn't a compelling reason to deny a right, then a human rights perspective would say that we should afford rights to people to control their own body or to decide who to vote for. We make the voting case as well. All right, and then just a few brief future directions. So one of the hats that I wear is I direct Youth Reproductive Equity, which is a national research network. We're about half PhD researchers, half physician scientists. We grew out of the Society of Family Planning. Society of Family Planning is a fabulous organization that does incredible work, but adolescents had not historically been a focus, and there was a group of us that were very interested in adolescents. And so we have banded together to try and fill in the research that has not been done on adolescents to inform clinical practice, policy, and future research. So we're a national network. We're very interdisciplinary. I won't read you all of our disciplines, but our goal is to produce and translate high-quality research on adolescent and young adult sexual and reproductive health. And so immediately post-Dobbs, I partnered with some of my clinician colleagues to get the word out both to general pediatricians and to adolescent health providers what the disproportionate needs of minors were now that abortion was restricted. I told you about some of the op-ed that we've done. We accepted every media request that we got in that time, because what we noticed is that when folks were listing the groups that they expected to be disproportionately impacted by Dobbs, they were listing all number of very important groups, but they weren't listing young people. And we wanted to make sure that as we were anticipating consequences, that we were talking about what young people were going to experience. And then most recently, we had some grant funding to do this research agenda. So it's called Adolescent Post-Dobbs, a policy-driven research agenda for minor adolescents and abortion. Because minors are underrepresented in the research, the lack of data is an equity issue, but also a scientific liability and a policy liability. If you have no evidence, how can you be evidence informed? And we're very open to kind of the misuses of science against young people as a result of not having the evidence there to refute it. It affords non-evidence-based policy. It's available for download here. I encourage you to download it, and it's forthcoming in peer-reviewed format. So our goal was to describe the need for research on minors. So why is this even important? Why do we care? Identify the many policies that impact minors' abortion in addition to the abortion policies we're all aware of. There are many that target minors in particular. And then lay out a clear and actionable path for how we build the science of adolescence and abortion access. And we emphasize that this is not just about abortion. This matters for all young people's development. And that final message is for funders who may be nervous about abortion as a topic. We really wanted to show that this is a youth development topic. This is generation-wide. This is impacting everyone. So we did an expert consensus panel that of course included young people, researchers, clinicians, leaders of nonprofit and RJ organizations, and legal and policy experts. And we couldn't get this group to stop talking. And it was just the most magic, rambunctious, incredible gathering. Nobody would get off the Zoom. I mean, these were 3-hour Zooms and nobody would leave. This was a passionate group. So writing the report of all of their input was quite a challenge because there was a lot of material. But what we did do was we indexed, we did a policy scan of both protective and restrictive policies, minor specific, and those that are impacting all ages. So that was a big lift there. And then we characterized the impacts of these policies as direct and indirect. So direct being policies that directly impact a pregnant person. And what we noticed here is that we lack adequate data to quantify and describe minors' abortion experiences. You saw my trend lines that I couldn't extend. 3% of studies are including minors. The Post-Dobbs, the real-time data collection that we have is not collecting age. So We Count is not collecting age or race or anything except state of residence, or no, state where you got the abortion. And so we're not able to stratify by a lot of variables that we would like to. So we recommend, so this is it's a meaty research agenda. I can't do it justice here, but essentially what we recommend is that studies that are abortion focused, of which there are many, there are standing studies that have traditionally focused on adults, could be expanded to include minors. There's a real tendency to start all of these studies at age 18, and we are more than willing to help folks learn how to include minors in those studies as well. But because minors have specific needs, we recommend tailored studies that are specifically also focused on minors to complement the national panel type work. And then we recommend, and this is where many of you come in because many of you do these population representative studies that aren't necessarily focused on abortion or on sexual and reproductive health. There are a number, we need those studies. We need to understand the context of adolescents' lives as abortion access is changing because this is related to education and jobs and family formation and health and all the things that we study. And so we're happy to discuss with you ways that your data can be optimized for use in studying the impacts of restrictive reproductive health policies on the total adolescent population. Okay, and then as of 10 days ago, our grant on state policies has been funded. So this was, I was surprised to learn myself. It's a typo, it goes through 2028, apologies. We thought we'd stop pre-Dobbs. I was surprised to learn, because I am a person who uses big national longitudinal data sets all the time, that we don't have one of those for state reproductive health policies. And so, of course, if we wanted to understand the impact of either restrictive or protective policies, we would need those longitudinal data to line up with our outcomes data. And so we wrote this proposal to NICHD because we know that states are really the center of gravity with SRH policy, and that there's a need for both transparency and documentation in order to enable anti-racist research, but also the meaty causal research that we all like to do. And I'm also hopeful that this dashboard will have other audiences. I get calls from reporters, I get calls from people who are teaching, calls from people who are giving presentations, who would really love to have this data to present. And so we're building a publicly available data dashboard. We're using legal epidemiology, sexual and reproductive health, and data science. So we have some data science folks here from ISR, as well as some great web developers. And we're working with Temple University, who is the home of legal epidemiology, to do the legal coding. So lawyers doing this. And it's over 150 policies, 50 states, 55 years. So it's a big undertaking. But we're eager to partner with all of you. So in this grant, we'll just create the database, but in future grants, we would love to link with outcomes data and with and make it kind of as user-friendly as possible. So please talk with me about that. All right, and then acknowledgements to NICHD, the William T. Grant Foundation, Society of Family Planning, and University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you so much.
Really, I couldn't turn on the something going on with sound. So these microphones are not on, so the on Zoom can still hear. So yeah. we definitely have time for some questions for Julie, and I also asked the ones in case they I'll get us started, Julie. So you were showing those fantastically impressive rises in the percentage of folks who are thinking about fibrillation for
Who did it?
sterilization. What were the base levels? Because we saw the percentage change, but
Yes.
how many folks in the 18 to 24s are pursuing those procedures? Just ballpark.
It's like 800 a month.
800 people, but
Oh,
so it's
is that what
a
you're-
small percentage
Yes.
of people. But the
Yes.
numbers rose, like the
Yes.
numbers strategically.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, so it's a small number of people, but big increases.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I can get you the exact numbers, but I did look it up because.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kim.
I was curious about your thoughts about the sort of distinction between how much of, especially post-Dobbs actually, access issues are a function of like actual legal changes, meaning like an X age person can't do Y, versus the amount of kind of procedural kinds of things that have to go through to access something that we're seemingly legally allowed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So like ID requirements or things like that. I was just curious if you had thought about this in terms of adults, but not really adolescents. So I'm sort of curious how you can think about that.
Well, it's both, right? So if you're in a state where abortion is banned, then it's banned. And so your options are telehealth or travel. And telehealth is complicated. There are many, many people trying to characterize this. But essentially, it depends on where the doctor is licensed and what their shield law covers in terms of where they're allowed. So for some telehealth, you have to be physically in the state. So like if anybody uses telehealth here in Michigan, they make you sign a thing that says you're in the state of Michigan receiving the care. So sometimes you don't have to travel for telehealth. So, but there are other impediments. So ID requirements to enter the portal, to write payment. So adolescents are not, most adolescents don't have a credit card, right? Like you can't get a credit card until you're 18 unless, right? So even in a state where it is legal, you're hitting all sorts of impediments. And then some telehealth providers, although it is legal, so some states don't allow telehealth to minors, period. Some don't allow it for abortion. But even in states where it's legal, some providers are reticent to do it because they're afraid that they may be targeted and be sued and be shut down. So there's little less access. And then travel is going to be logistically complicated for all the reasons. So I think it depends on if you're in a banned state or a not banned state. If you're in a banned state, then it's banned. If you're in a state with gestational limits, where it's sort of a gray area, then we have to deal with misinformation. So do you know? Because some people think that it's banned completely, right? In a state that has limits. There are some states where bans are sometimes pending due to ongoing litigation, and then people don't always know if a ban is in effect or not. So they essentially proceed as though the ban is in effect. So there's that level of confusion. There's are providers willing to give information to minors, and so not all are. And there are states where providers are not allowed. So both Missouri and Texas have statutes about aiding and abetting abortion, which have been interpreted to even include giving information. And those are punishable by civil offenses, so they can be sued. And so they're reticent to give information. So I think it's both. Is this helping? Like
Yeah.
they layer. Yeah.
Okay,
One
thing.
Yeah.
You showed the slide with this abortion level by state for adolescents.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that the states that were going to have abortion bans were already lower, and that might be because of limited access pre-Dobbs. I was wondering if you have a sense for like how much of the variation between states is like culture versus adolescent behavior versus limited access.
I have no idea. I couldn't give you percentages. I think all of those are definitely involved. And the unofficial thinking about this is that in states that now have bans, there was little access prior to Dobbs, right? Because there was opposition and there were a lot of regulations and it was difficult to offer the service. And so that may be part of the reason that we haven't seen huge decreases in the number of abortions, is because in the places where it's now banned, they weren't doing the majority of the abortions anyway. And so at least for now, travel, telehealth, and other things have been able to make up the difference. There's a concern because how long is that sustainable for, right? There's a lot of funding, a lot of people working overtime, a lot of resources going into trying to fill that gap. But for now, it seems to be holding.
I think we have to cut us off at this point, but fortunately for us, Julie is right down the street in the School of Nursing and is joining the Pop Center, so you'll be able to pick her magnificent brain at your leisure. But thank you all for coming and for the great questions, and thanks for a fantastic talk, Julie.